Hello, everyone. This is Trip, and I'm here with two of my friends. They're smart, they're articulate, they're fun, and we're getting here to really ask a whole bunch of questions and wrestle with the last 20 years. We're coming up on the anniversary of 9/11, and so much has happened and so much has changed, and especially for people that are trying to figure out what it means to be a person of faith, a follower of Jesus, or just dealing with the baggage from it. 9/11 became a really an impetus for all sorts of changes. It intensified them. It brought them out in the open. And just in we were talking about doing this, this online class together, the list of all the things that have happened in the last 20 years that sent shockwaves right through our lives on this planet and in the church is huge. And I know that a whole lot of you, like me, have enjoyed the wisdom of Brian and Diana throughout the last 20 years. So when I talked them into doing this, I got real excited because, there's very few people I just like innately trust, even when they tell me I'm wrong. So thank you both for doing this. Now, maybe before we jump into the first session, like, why did you say yes to doing this, and what was the question or the issue that you've been hearing recently that made you say, I think it'd be worth wrestling with it in public?
Well, I said yes because you ask, and I'm actually usually pretty accommodating to your request, Trip. I think you know that by now. But I thought it was a really worthwhile thing to review in our minds and also our sort of emotional, spiritual lives, what the last 20 years has wrought. And when you suggested to do it with Brian, I thought that was just a fantastic discussion, in part because Brian and I really met for the very first time not long after 9/11. And so the friendship and the collegial work relationship that we've had through the years and all of the conversations we've had in private and in public have all had this shadow of 9/11 behind them. And so I thought it would be really worthwhile to be in public and see where we have gone with all of this and let our friends listen in.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Diana. I'll tell you a weird little train of thought that's been going on for me. I think January 6th, 2021 is going to be a traumatic year in a lot of people's minds. It's either going to be the year in the US that we say we came really, really close to a coup and losing our democracy, or we're going to say it was the first blow that led to a coup and the loss of democracy, depending on how things go the next couple of years. So to me, the trauma of of January 6th of this year, 2021, is a really big deal. Of course, I think Charlottesville was a huge deal as well. And then I started just thinking, gosh, there've been one huge deal after another going back to 20 years ago. And so you just think, for me, bookended September 11th and January 6th, for me, creates this set of events that show the world's leading superpower in 2000 shows its weakness to an outside attacker in 2001, and shows its incredible vulnerability to inside rot and decay in 2021.
Yeah, both of those events, as we just began to launch into this, also revealed the role that religion plays in these really painful moments in history in the last 20 years, because there's a lot of events, and religion is a little bit more obscured in some of them, like the Great Recession. But when it comes to 9/11 and what that did in terms of religion and understanding Islam and the militarization of Christianity in the West, I mean, it was huge. And then, of course, here in the United States, the January 6th insurrection, I will never get out of my mind that one photograph of the guy holding up the Jesus Saves sign, standing not far away from a gallows that had been erected to hang Mike Pence, to hang the Vice President of the United States. And that picture of the collusion and the complete corruption of Christianity that was on display on January 6th was unavoidably obvious. Mm-hmm. And so it's been 20 years of world-shattering events, and 20 years of world-shattering events with incredible religious and spiritual dimensions that have turned our hearts, heads, churches, faith communities inside out, upside down, and backwards.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, Trip, what would you add to that, or what resonates with you?
Well, I mean, I think for me, as a geriatric millennial, the 9/11 was my freshman year of college, and so it shaped my whole time in early ministry situations, going through divinity school where people are starting to wrestle with it, to then the first time, to then thinking about congregational leadership, spiritual formation in that context, to then what do you do when passing on the Christian tradition, when first time I taught systematic theology after it. And I think that one of the big responses after 9/11 for religious people, regardless of where they existed theologically, was to assume that some point in the past had it right. And I think that if you just in our brief list of everything that's happened, yes, there are treasures to gain from the past, but a return to the past completely or going back to a pristine moment's no longer viable for a whole lot of reasons, right? If we didn't get it when we realized we could nuke the planet, and we aren't getting it when we know we can kill it, when we can no longer treat the church or a constitutional democracy as like settled, the level of tenuousness that exists in our present is one we need to think in a different tone. And just in, the last few days thinking about starting this, I picked back up City of God, and I feel like I've never read it where I appreciate Augustine's like realist stare at the fall of Rome, and said, here's I tend to use Augustine as someone to be a foil against as a process theologian, but City of God has a tonality that I resonate with again. And I think it's going to be important for leaders in religious communities to shift from being the champions and fine tuners of a system we know succeeds and is worthwhile and trustworthy, to ones that are having to negotiate the wheat and tares in and outside of the church again, with a level of seriousness. If someone awakened essentially to just how screwed up human beings are, right? That it's his ability to stare our brokenness in the face that makes him trustworthy. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons I've want to take seriously as we do this. It's the when Obama wasn't Obama kind of moment,
It's interesting you would bring up that the City of God. That was a thread in a little book I wrote in 2004 called Broken We Kneel. And I'm not known as an Augustinian fan either, so it's like, to hear me talk well about Augustine always surprises people. But there was, at that moment, I believe it was Jerome, who said, if Rome has fallen, what can be secure? And that a good part of, if the story that I'm recalling is correct, a good part of Augustine's reflection was around that, because the church was caught up in that fear that Jerome articulated. If Rome is fallen, what can be secure? Rome is the eternal city. Rome is the seat of Christian empire. What do you mean? Rome is fallen. And so for Christians in 9/11, it was a very similar thing. And it wasn't just Christians, of course, it was people around the world. It's like, if the Twin Towers have fallen, what could be secure? If New York has fallen, what can be secure? And so the continuities, the sort of historical resonances, I'd rather say, between what Augustine was reflecting upon in terms of the end of a civilization and what really counts as eternal. And this last 20 years, I actually think that a huge amount of the work that Brian and I have done is in that quest of the seeking out of what is lasting and joyful and beautiful and just. And we've tried to do that. I can't equate either of us to Augustine, but I think both of us have tried to do that in our writing and our preaching and forming community and the questions we've raised, because we've felt that, in the same way Augustine felt Jerome's question.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's really good. I now I'm gonna have to go check the Jerome thing. That's high quality material. All the ministers just wrote it down. So the format we're thinking of doing, which we'll see if we keep it by the time we get done, is we're going to take turns kicking off, where each of us will dig into a particular feature that strikes us in thinking about this past 20 years since 9/11, and that will set up a conversation that will go wherever it goes, and will be informed by questions and topics you send in. Everyone in the class, you get emails before and after each session. You can reply to them, and any of those emails, when you reply, just stick a question at the top, or if there's a topic you want us to talk about, we'll weave some of them into the sessions. And also, Brian, Diana will join a number of times live just to answer questions. So if it is specific that, oh, Diana, you brought this up in the first session, what about this? Then just make sure you tell me, and I will chronicle it and ask questions. And maybe one of you will have a question so striking it will inspire one of them to write another City of God. But with that, I'm going to mute myself and let Diana take it away for the first session.
Great. Thank you, Trip. I wanted today to talk about the topic of Christian decline post 9/11, and it's a funny topic in certain ways. In order to really get our minds around what's happened in the last 20 years, I think it's important to step back into the 1990s. And the 1990s were a time when religion publishing was huge. All you needed to do was write a book with Jesus on in the title, and the book would just dart to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. There were spiritual memoirs that were talked about just not just in churches, but as sort of regular common currency. Book groups would read spiritual memoirs. People like Annie Dillard and Anne Lamott and Kathleen Norris were considered to be sort of the literary masters, almost as it were, of the category of memoir, and they all wrote about religion. And I remember that Phyllis Tickle founded the Publishers Weekly religion pages in the 1990s, because the book industry around religion was so incredibly financially lucrative, and it was a giant market. And there were all kinds of really interesting trends in the 1990s. There was this big angel craze that went on for several years. There were people who actually opened stores in real life malls that used to exist in the United States, brick and mortar stores, and they would be sort of like spirituality shops. I remember visiting one in the Mall of America in the late 1990s, and you could walk into the shop and you could buy tchotchkes from basically any world religion you could think of, and there was a huge selection of books and magazines and other kinds of materials that would help you, aid you in your spiritual quest. Wade Clark Roof wrote a book called A Generation of Seekers that sort of captured the moment. And the world, of course, was heading toward the new millennium. And so it was that anticipation of the new millennium, the 2000th birthday of Christianity, the fact that we were getting this number that was turning, that seemed to foster a kind of a mystical, kind of religious, interfaith revival, where all the biggest news was about religion. And everyone who knew anything about religion, from people sitting in classrooms at major universities to people at Publishers Weekly to the people at Time Magazine to the people who were in congregations, everybody was expecting growth. And even in the old main line, which had been going through 30 or 40 years worth of decline by that point, there was an increase in membership in the 1990s, and not just an increase in membership. These are the liberal Protestant churches, which had suffered so much post 1970s. Those liberal Protestant churches not only were recording a little bit of a membership increase, but their average Sunday attendance numbers were actually shockingly high. And so there was this period in the late 90s where the Episcopal Church was around 2 million members. And that's a, still fairly robust enough size denomination, but not a huge denomination. But what they were showing in terms of average Sunday attendance numbers was about 800,000 people in their churches every single Sunday. And so it was almost half of the denomination that was showing up, or at least, registering their presence in buildings. So that was what it was like in the last years of the 1990s. This huge, economically profitable bodies in buildings, people purchasing religious goods, sort of, wow, this is among the biggest news in the block. And a lot of my early work was around that, actually. It was in those years that the New York Times wire service hired me as a columnist, and I wrote a weekly column that went over the New York Times syndicate on religion in America, and wrote about many of these trends. So that's kind of where we were before 9/11, was in this highly successful religious sort of landscape in the United States. There were other things happening in other countries around the world. I realized that. But the sort of the energy and enthusiasm, I think, of American religion was rubbing off in interesting ways in Western Europe, certainly in Canada, and also in Latin America and Africa, with huge mission movements coming out of evangelicalism in that decade. So where we were. And then 9/11. I cannot think of anything that surprised me more than to watch the statistics start coming in after 9/11 of decline around Christianity. At first, those statistics were not divided up by race, they were simply divided up by denomination. And so we had 9/11 in September of 2001. And that was a shock to sort of the religious ecology of the world. But then there was a second shock that came just on its heels and was equally as powerful, and it was also global. And that was at the beginning of 2002, the Boston Globe began a series of reports on how Catholic priests in Boston had systematically abused children in their care, and that the systematic abuse of children had been covered up by the Boston Archdiocese, and that priests had never essentially been punished for this, that they had just been moved around. Abusing priests had just been moved around. And that story, which began, I believe, in January of 2002, stretched into the report stretched into March 2002. It was a huge series. And it began to look like it was a cover up well beyond the Boston Archdiocese, that there was some larger problem within global Catholicism about abuse, sexual abuse, and how the church had handled it. And so you have the one story in September, followed by this story in February and March. And by the next September 2002, what you begin to see is a radical decline of the number of people who are willing to call themselves Catholics. And you start to see numbers that are softening around Protestantism in America. And as late as 2001, Protestants were still the majority of people in the United States. And so, but that begins to shift as a result of these two huge events. Just this past July, it was on July 8th, Public Religion Research came out with, I believe it's its 13th report on religious adherence in the United States, what people call themselves. And this report showed a couple of things that are old news and a couple of things that are actually new news. And the part of the report that wasn't entirely startling, and that most people on this in this course will be aware of, is that decline that started in the wake of 2001, 2002, in wake of 9/11 and the Catholic Church abuse scandal, that decline became precipitous through the last 20 years. At first, it looked like, the sort of the Protestant mainline decline was continuing, which it sort of did after a little rebirth in the 90s. It kind of went soft again in the early aughts. But the Catholic number, I mean, that literally started falling like a rock. And then we started seeing this softening of the evangelical number in the early part of the aughts. By 2020, that's what this PRI report covers. What we see is that those patterns have largely continued, with one exception, which I'll mention in a moment. And while the religious quadrant was softening, while people were leaving religion, people were bailing out statistically into a category that was called none of the above, the religiously unaffiliated. And so the way that has tracked for most of the last 2 decades has been watching every year when these statistics come out, the percentage of people who are Christian, and then they divided that into white and Christian, Black Christians and Christians of color. Eventually, through the last 20 years, we got the racial sort of razor brought in to look at that data more closely. But the percentage of people who are white Protestants and white Catholics was going down. And the bigger surprise or what began to surprise people in this data was that evangelicalism, once considered to be a category that was untouchable by religious decline, was declining. And indeed, in the Religious Landscape survey this year, I've got the number right here. In 2006, the percentage of people in America who were white evangelicals was 23% of the population. And in the most recent data available, 2020, that percentage is 14.5% of the population. That means that in a little bit more than a decade, the percentage of people who are willing to identify with evangelicalism, this is white people who are willing to identify with evangelicalism, has gone down 10 points and gone from being basically 1 in 4 of every American to what is 1 in, I guess, 6 of all Americans. That number, this little number that I've got on my phone right here, if I had, say, sitting next to me, the Venerable Martin Marty, who has been following, Martin Marty is 25 years older than I am. And he's been following these kinds of statistics even longer. He years ago told me that evangelicalism always winds up being somewhere between 25 to 33% of the American population, never lower, never higher. Well, the great Dr. Marty, I would love to hear what he said about this, because this is a shocking number. Of course, if you add evangelicals of color to this, you do get a higher percentage of the population as a total. But this decline among white evangelicalism is unlike any decline that we have numbers for in American history. Period. Full stop. And so this chart showed that continuing decline to this point of a number that statisticians don't know what to do with. And at this point, that number has created on Twitter and other social media a huge argument among people who don't believe it. My friends at Public Religion Research say they have fielded more calls from critics than they have ever gotten for a survey in the last few weeks since the publication of this data. And yet it's also been kind of the cause of people going, wow, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad. So this is a piece of continuing news, not a total surprise, but the actual number has been surprising. The other pieces, we do see this same strength among the community of people, and that this is not divided racially. The community of people who are religiously unaffiliated from 2006 to now. In 2006, the percentage of the population who were religiously unaffiliated was 16%. That percentage has never gone down in this data collection until the last 2 years. It reached a high of over 25% in 2018. 2019, it was 24%. So sort of statistically almost in the same place. But this past year, it went down to 23%, which was a surprise to people. It means that there's some level of stability, or even a few sort of points of people who are peeling away from being identified to putting themselves in some category of religion now. And that's where the really big surprise came for me in this data. So if people are leaving white evangelicalism, and if people are beginning to re-affiliate with some form of religion from being religiously unaffiliated, the question emerges, well, where are they going? Well, they apparently are not becoming white Catholics because the percentage of white Catholicism has remained around 12% of the population for quite some time. It's a very sort of steady number. the only number on this data chart that went up was among white, not evangelical Protestants, which is a category that's also sometimes called white mainline Protestants. And what we see in the last 4 years, since reaching their low of 12.8% of the population in 2016, same year Donald Trump was elected, interestingly enough, each year since, the percentage number of white evangelicals has gone, or white mainliners, non-evangelicals, has gone up in the population to this year to 16.4%, where for the very first time since 1970, this is this kind of data you just can't even, this is why people are calling PRI. They can't literally believe these numbers, but there they are. The first time since 1970, there's a higher percentage of white non-evangelical Protestants than there are of white evangelical Protestants. And the hemorrhaging out of white Protestantism has stopped. And it stopped because of liberals, not because of evangelicals. And so this is just really interesting data. And it's largely a story of the last 20 years of two initiating crises, sort of shocking the system of global Christianity. And in America, that shock became the I don't know if it was the cause exactly. I don't know if you can kind of say cause and effect, but it certainly became an initiating event that that led to, or that contributed to, a precipitous decline in adherence among America's white population. And then in the last 4 years since the election of Donald Trump, we've seen a sort of rearrangement of whatever is going on within that larger story of decline. It's literally, I got my PhD in American religious history in 1991. Like I said, spent the early part of my career tracking the religious enthusiasm leading up to the millennium. And no one I know was prepared for statistics like this in the 1990s. And yet we've lived this story for the last 20 years.
Wow. Great summary. You've given us a lot to chew on there, Diana. I should say, I don't want to mention any names here, but I just saw an article this morning published in Christianity Today that is trying to present the data very, very differently, saying, that evangelicals don't have much to worry about compared to mainliners. So anyhow, interesting to watch people tell stories, interpret data in very different ways. But one other thought that hit me as you were speaking, when I was a child growing up in elementary school in the 1960s, I think you could make an assumption that religion would never be mentioned in any of my classrooms in public school, and that the assumption of most educated people was that religion was on the decline. And this sort of feeling that, religion will fade away, just slowly fade away. Then it seems like we had this period, maybe the Jesus movement represented one wave of this, and then the religious right coming to life in the late 1970s, and which, by the way, to watch fundamentalist Christians line up behind Ronald Reagan really was like a test case for them lining up behind Donald Trump. It's kind of bizarre to watch, it being almost the run-up, because Ronald Reagan was from Hollywood, for crying out loud, and he was divorced and not a churchgoer and all the rest. But then there was this feeling that, and in some ways, September 11, 2001 marked this moment where the most secular people had to say, religion is not gone. and it might not be, it might be here for good, but not for good. In other words, it might be here to stay, but for no good. And I have this memory, you're still in the DC area, Diana, but I lived in the DC area in 2001. And I remember going down a couple blocks from my house, and I could see the pillars of smoke coming up from the Pentagon, which just had this sort of, Sodom and Gomorrah feel to it, of just this apocalyptic vision. But I was driving on September 12th in my car, and I remember exactly where I was on Route 29 in Silver Spring, if anybody knows where that is. And there was a press conference, and some military figure from the Pentagon was speaking, and a journalist said, "Do you have any experts helping you understand Islam and Islamic extremism?" And I remember this because you don't normally hear somebody laugh in a grave moment like that, but he had like a chuckle and he said something like, "We're not in the religious business." So it's September 11th marks this strange moment where we've assumed religion's going away. It's coming back with a vengeance. But that very act of coming back with a vengeance, it seems to me, sows the seed for this decline, because people of goodwill, people who are just nice people, don't want to be associated with something that seems that hateful. And that's, to me, why September 11, 2001 and January 6, 2021 really have this resonance, because in a sense we saw the ugliest face of Islam, of extremist Islam in 2001. And then, I'm thinking of Rene Girard and the whole idea of mimetic theory, that groups react and as they react, they imitate. And so you end up with a violent, hostile, religious insurgency showing up at the Capitol. And people like Franklin Graham and Eric Metaxas and Robert Jeffress and Jerry Falwell Jr. and many other names who I think need to be mentioned. I just think we need to mention those names. We have to say their names as the supporters of Donald Trump and this whole thing. I think we just have to see now, we're at this is the perfect time to have reflection on this, I think.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Brian, where did you go to elementary school?
In Rockville, Maryland, Rock Creek Valley Elementary. Yeah.
Yeah. See, I always think it's so funny because our lives were so close to one another, and we didn't know each other until, what was it, 2002 or 2002 or 2003. But I grew up in Baltimore City.
Yeah.
And so I was in Maryland public school systems, at the same time. And as soon as you say, we grew up in this world where religion was never mentioned in public school. And there was this idea of a very strict separation of church and state. People were very religious. And this is the interesting thing to me, is that we were kind of in the same school system, but we were on different sides of the religion divide. Because my parents were liberal Methodists. And, I was in church every single Sunday as a little kid, and everyone in my neighborhood was. And they were either in Methodist church or Catholic church. And there were very few people who would admit to not going to church. And at the very edge of my neighborhood, there was this sort of independent Pentecostal church. And it didn't have a real church building. It met in some other kind of building. And everybody in our neighborhood kind of looked at that church and kind of went, what? Well, who are those people? But I think that they're probably the people your family was.
That's right.
That's, one of the things about that is, I grew up in rural North Carolina until we church planted in a city. And America, the way it was secular was that it kept the public and private line clear, right? Like that used to be how we did it. So you wouldn't worry about religion showing up at school because that was a private thing. Unlike, say, the way secular it later gets played out, where it's kind of, is something religious or not religious? That kind of older account of secularity was such an important part for America when the church was culture dominant. Like in rural North Carolina, the religious diversity was the kind of Baptist you were in Granville County, North Carolina.
Right.
I remember when a missionary Baptist moved in, and we were worried, like, are they Christian? You know, and and I just know my children never had that. They grew up in Los Angeles and are now in Scotland. And it so it is like a huge shift just to think about the who your neighbor is in the tactile sense changes questions of religion. And I wonder if there's a way that, the because Protestants took beliefs so seriously and then chronicled the correct beliefs in all sorts of different ways and get all these different denominations. But the anxiety for so many Christians was like, are you believing the right things? And then the threats were the ways in which outside forces or ideas fragilized these beliefs. And that was problematic, right? And the evangelical movement emerges as a resistance to the way modernity brings in different types of critical thinking and such. But what's shocking with the way you were telling the story, and I'd be interested if you think this is something or not, is the big fragilization that actually changed our demographics are when religion is public, something like 9/11. And I think what we're seeing now is something like January 6th, that these public demonstrations of religion problematize the traditions in ways evolution doesn't really do that.
Yeah, and if you think about the Catholic Church abuse scandal, I mean, you're
Mhm.
talking about something
Yeah.
that happened in private being made public. And all of a sudden what had the secret was kept, and so the people who were victimized, they lived in shame, they lived in this sort of shadows, and the pressing out of their stories created a public narrative about abuse and violence and all these sorts of things that I think Brian just said it so perfectly, is that people began to see that religion was around for good and it wasn't for good. And I the comparison that more recent comparison that I can come up with, and the reason I was sort of asking Brian a little bit about his elementary school experience, was that in the 1960s, the primary narrative that there was about religion in the United States, it was partly this public-private split narrative. Religion was private, and then this sort of secular space that we shared, that was the public space. But there was a second narrative, and that was that wealthy societies, wealthy democratic societies, had all become more secular, and that the United States was more secular than it had been perhaps several generations earlier, but because of this private religious thing that was so robust, that we sort of bucked the trend of secularization in the same way that the European publics had embraced secularization. And we could see religion in decline, rapid decline, post World War II, throughout European countries. And so I think there was in the United States this little bit of this worry that, are we going to become like Europe religiously? And even the liberal Methodists that I hung around, they didn't want that to happen. They wanted Protestantism. We understood ourselves to be a Protestant country. I mean, I can't even believe I grew up in a world like this, but we understood ourselves to be a Protestant nation, and that we were proud of that. And we didn't want to be like the Europeans. And yet there was this undertow that might happen to us too, because it had happened to them. And I think that the connection there to 9/11 is really fascinating, because the Europeans had to deal with the religion is here for good, but not for good reasons, or not for good purposes, in the wake of the Holocaust, where you could really see how Christianity had been manipulated and abused to the point of murdering 6 million people in systematic genocide. And so the Europeans had to face that public ugliness a lot earlier than we did in the United States, where we were still holding on to this sort of mythos of Protestant purity, and we're going to save the world for democracy, and we're the good guys in this movie, and all of that kind of stuff that we grew up with. And it really did not come undone for most Americans until 9/11, when and I really do think the combination of 9/11 and the very worst of Catholicism at the same time becoming there's a publicly enacted just horrors
Yeah.
in the name of religion.
And it's so ironic that Protestants thought of themselves as so pristine with the history of slavery and genocide of indigenous peoples. But I think it's very hard for even people, Trip, your age, to believe how totally successful that purity narrative was for kids. For when and I'm older than Diana, but when we were kids, it still was intact. And so ironic that right as we're having this conversation, there are all these battles about critical race theory and attempts to dumb down public education to not tell the truth about American history. There's this desperate grasp to reclaim that mythic narrative of purity. Hey, I wonder if I could, this might take us too far afield. So Trip, feel free to, redirect us here. But Diana, I'm thinking of you as a historian, and I'm thinking that the 30 Years' War, what was it, 1618 to 1648, I think is when it was, that the 30 Years' War in some ways prepares the way for the Enlightenment and sort of a superpowering of secularism to say, whenever religion gets involved, we have bloodshed. Could we just get reasonable, of course, then it was men around a table, and reasonable white landowning privileged men around a table, and they'll agree and solve all our problems. So you have that religious violence leading to decline in religion. And then I've often wondered has anybody talked much about World War II being seen as a failure of Christianity? Here, all of these so-called Christian nations, most of them Protestant, Protestant in the North and Catholic in the South, unable to stop Hitler and Mussolini. That really becomes an interesting pattern, because if religion has power, then its power didn't stop these horrible things from happening. And if it didn't have any power, what good is it? It's like a lose-lose for religion when violence breaks out like that. I'd love to hear any thoughts both of you have about that.
Well, the thing about the 30 Years' War is that's a really important point. There were some lectures I remember giving probably about 15 years ago, where I looked at what I called Modernity 1 and Modernity 2. And I pitched Modernity 1 beginning in the wake of the 30 Years' War, which most historians do pitch it there, and talked about how coming out of the 30 Years' War, you get this, you do get a kind of decline of conventional religiosity across Europe. You get the first understanding of atheism. As far as I am aware, that is when the term atheist was actually coined, and you get the first people coming out of the closet as actual non-believers in God. And we didn't even have language for that in European cultures until after the 30 Years' War, so, which I think is a really interesting thing if you look at what happened post 9/11 and the growth of new atheism. And then you also get, people just sort of questioning the religions they were born with, these newly burst forth actually religions of Protestantism or the new form of Catholicism that was born after the Reformation. And the people are saying, well, hey, this brought us a lot of trouble. So is there a better form? And that's when you begin to get the development of pietism and what eventually becomes the movements towards the religions of the heart. You get the devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus. You get very pious, warm, sort of inwardly directed forms of mystical Catholicism that become quite popular. And so that all happens post Modernity 1. But I think your question about World War II is really fascinating. I am not aware of a book that does that, but that could be because most of my reading in the last 10 years has been in different fields other than that particular one. But the thing that really just burst into my imagination while you were talking is the fact that, yes, it was a failure of Western Christianity, but English speaking Christians did not see it as a failure. As a matter of fact, you could pitch World War II as a sort of, I've been meaning to say World War II, World War II as a failure of continental Christianity.
Mm.
But Anglo Protestant Christians thought that they had succeeded.
Yes.
And so what you get immediately following World War II in Anglo Protestant countries is you get Billy Graham.
Yes.
You get the revival of sort of a really pious form of personalized form of Christianity that will eventually feed what becomes the religious right. And so I think that we could look at sort of Anglo-Protestant hubris in the years following World War II as a sort of a last gasp of that sort of racially energized Protestant vision.
Mhm.
Yeah.
First articulated, it was articulated really strongly around 1900 in a book called Our Country by Josiah Strong, who was a liberal minister who really created a whole vision of white Anglo-Saxon supremacy as being the sort of moral vision for the world. And I think that World War II sort of put a stamp of approval on that.
Yeah.
And that's why I think the racial issues have been so hard to deal with. And that's just a really interesting question to me. I was binge watching The Queen, the Crown this week. And I watched the episode. I just recently watched the episode of the Queen and the Billy Graham visit. And, think about how incredible that moment was in the late 1950s. I think that was 1957. And yet everybody in those episodes, everybody thinks that England is right because it won.
Yes.
And English Christianity is morally superior to every other form of Christianity that there is. And so I just think that's fascinating, because that might well be the last gasp of that particular vision. And it just so happens that you and I were born at the end of that. We were born into that. I mean, that was the air that we breathed. And so Trip, when Brian says you don't remember it because you're 20 years younger than we are, it really shows a kind of a break in the culture, where folks who are my age and Brian's age, we've had to work really hard to stay in church. We had to literally self-consciously reject everything that we were taught as children. We had to relearn history, technology, politics. We had to relearn our own senses of of identity. And then we had to decide if it was worth it to do all that work. And so you can kind of understand, if you like me and Brian, and obviously we think you do, is that people who are our age, who have done that amount of work, we're kind of rare. I mean, it's impossible. Brian and I have plenty of friends who have also done this work with us. That's why we could do the work. But when you look at our generation, there's a whole lot of people who would just much rather kept the mythologies that they had in place when they were kids, because it was just too hard to do anything else.
When you bring up the World War II thing, it's fascinating. You mentioned Strong, and that triggered. I read a bunch of the Walter Rauschenbusch biographies because they're both social gospelers. Right. And one of the big things that World War I did was get all the ethnic churches, or churches attached to a particular part of continental Europe, to attach themselves to American Protestantism. And after that, you get the finalization of a lot of the denominations we have today. So that World War II, the role America and the UK plays in World War II, it becomes this means of justifying, right, Anglo-shaped Christianity, and luckily capitalism and a whole host of other things go along with it, right? So I know Brian's talked a lot about it before, about the way the post World War II Christianity sets the stage for really the explosion in the global South, gets more and more taken over by Anglo forms, essentially, of Christianity. So that now one of the things we've exported, right, is a Christianity that has is able to tell itself sanitizing self stories that are then blind, right, to the fact that we've inherited stolen land. It's built on dead bodies, right? Like we have internalized that and then exported it. And I think that's part of what, for me, and definitely those younger than me, that I was their youth minister, Christianity in America after 9/11, we never had a moment where we really thought we were the good guys, right? Like I watched the church say no to the biggest protest that's happened globally around the war in Iraq, right? And the number of people protesting at once was huge. And who was it? The Methodists in the White House, or his denomination could tell him no, and he didn't care, right? So there's this sense that, like, after that, all these institutions that set the stage for exporting across the globe just get falsified publicly by 9/11 and everything that goes in after it, be the collapse, all the stuff I'm sure we'll end up talking about. But I do think that that's, I hadn't thought of it that way, but there is a real shift that, what if your memory of the big institutions of modernity, be it the state, the economy, religion, for those that 9/11 was coming of age and younger, like, when were the glory days? Like, when was some time that you can even convince yourself we were on the right side? What would it look like to do so? Well, I think January 6th is an example of what it looks like to try to convince yourself at this point that our inheritance and our institutions are telling a winning, beautiful, good story. And so no 1611 project, critical race theory is crazy. And here's a perfect example. I just saw this. It just came out. The trailer for the new God's Not Dead movie.
It's about homeschooling, I've heard.
Yeah, but not just homeschooling. It's telling a story where they are literally going to outlaw talking about religion in America, even in homeschooling curriculum. They're going to go in and then forcibly move these students into schools so they can tell them about trans identity and how secularism's the greatest thing ever. Like, the phobia around that, right, is what's, God's not dead, he's surely alive, roaring like a lion. And you're like, that's what we've gotten to. But I think it's real. It's connected to that piece. I know Brian talks about it in his authoritarian book, like this need for a story that justifies the preservation of ill-gotten gains and your place in the world.
And Tripp, historically, what I think is really fascinating, because this is the conversation about decline, is that liberal Protestantism, the mainline denominations, for as easy as it is to heap on them and to see everything that's wrong with them, they did possess self-correcting mechanisms. And so, despite Anglo-Protestant triumphalism post-World War II, there were people in the mainline who did look at the flow of history and who did say, wait a second, we had Black people who were soldiers, sailors in World War II, helped us win this great victory, and now they've come back to the United States and look, they're treated like shit, and so this isn't right. This isn't what we're about. And so the mainline, at least in some portions of it, and those are the portions we valorize now, they began a sort of a self-corrective journey about race. It didn't happen fast enough, but it happened. It was happening, and it still is happening, interestingly enough. They also began a self-corrective journey about violence around Vietnam, and they began a self-corrective journey about women around feminism. And so the liberal traditions possessed enough sort of theological, liturgical, communal resources to be able to do that work of self-interrogation and examination and say, we need a different kind of church for a different kind of age, and to try to create a different story that would go along with that. But the tragedy of it is that those are the churches that declined in the 60s and the 1970s. And so they became a parable for other Protestants of what you can't do.
Yes.
And when they became that parable of what you can't do, other Protestants said, well, what can we do? Well, we're going to become more patriotic. And so by 1980, you got Jerry Falwell standing on the stairs of Thomas Road Baptist Church with a big choir behind him, all wearing red, white, and blue and waving flags. And so literally every single time you turned around, that form of that highly pious, hyper patriotic Protestantism, all white, was heaping on the main line at the same time, saying, oh, you can't do liberal Christianity, because if you start doing that kind of stuff, there's not going to be anybody left in your churches. Nobody wants to hear all that. And so this tradition became actually a tradition of denial and a tradition of rejection of any kind of self-criticism or genuine cultural reflection. And then they created a narrative of growth around that. If you go into that place of denial, if you go into that place where you refuse to look at this other historical evidence, your church is going to grow. And that's why this narrative was so dangerous at the end of the 20th century, and why there is nobody happier in America that narrative is dying right now than me. And if that Christianity Today piece was written because I've been making a big fuss about how much they're dying and the media is finally paying attention to me, God bless them. I hope Christianity takes me on every single day for the rest of my life, because it's like, literally, shut the F up, you know? Yeah. How often have you ever heard me say that? It's like that narrative, that evangelicals are always going to grow narrative, was the narrative that propelled this kind of white supremacist Christianity right to the steps of the Capitol in January 2021. And I don't want to hear any more of it. I'm over it, and I'm really glad the statistics are showing that I'm not alone anymore.
Yes.
I sounded like my grandmother right then.
You're preaching. Oh my goodness. I know we're probably getting near the time we need to wrap this up, but it strikes me that one way to describe this decline growth pattern is to say that churches can, broadly speaking, identify themselves as civil religions, where their job is to bless the nation's wars, to bless the nation's policies, to pray for forgiveness if the nation does wrong, but whether or not it prays for forgiveness, it pronounces forgiveness and justification. And there's other very positive things maybe that civil religions do too. They try to have standards of decency and all the rest to keep things rolling. But then you have prophetic religion that rises up to say our nation's a mess, our nation's hypocritical, our nation's lying, our nation's got buried skeletons. Let's face the truth. So you have that civil religions versus prophetic religion. And I think part of what we've seen is mainline Protestantism served as the civil religion through the world wars. And then when the 1960s came, it had the courage to become a prophetic religion and to name feminism and name what had been done to the native peoples, and to talk about the environment, the exploitation of the environment, and to talk about poverty, and to make race a central issue. And in by liberal Protestant clergy doing that in the 1960s, they broke the contract of a civil religion. And what you might say is that evangelicals were opportunists at that moment. And they said, here's our opportunity to sneak in and become the new civil religion, steal away mainline Protestants. And I think there's a way to say that Roman Catholics in the religious right, being a fusion of white conservative Protestants, white conservative Catholics, Roman Catholics sees their opportunity to say, we can be the civil religion too. And in many ways, these 20 years from 2001 to 2021, from September 11th to January 6th, these 20 years, it seems to me, show the where being a civil religion takes you, and the reckoning that you have to have, and so even though a lot of people hear the word decline and they think it's really too bad, I think part of what you're saying is good riddance of civil religion that defends the indefensible. Good riddance. And that maybe sets us up for some of our future conversations, because this decline is one of the best opportunities that a genuine form of Christianity has ever had, to say that race is a pivotal gospel issue, poverty is a pivotal gospel issue, care for the environment is a pivotal gospel issue, and a radical reframing of our faith. So that decline, it seems to me, is a phenomenal opportunity. And I think we have to say, as you just did, Diana, I sure don't want to go back. There's nothing I want to go back to. I want to move forward.
And that little tiny uptick in the statistics that were present in the July 8th data, I don't see that as hopeful and good news in the sense that, oh my gosh, the churches could be big again. What I see it as hopeful and good news is that maybe this much reduced mainline has finally done enough public work that people who are searching for Protestant identity that is reflective, that wants to engage issues of race, that's happy to have women clergy, that's welcoming to LGBTQ people, that's trying to create a different kind of vision of a truly pluralistic table, Eucharistic table, that there are legitimately enough Americans who are searching for that they're wandering toward some of these older churches again. And that's where I think the good news is, not that the churches are going to grow or that they're going to become, influential in the public square or any of that kind of stuff, but that maybe the long, hard work of inviting some percentage of white people into a new story might finally be paying off. In terms of people understanding what's been happening in that quadrant of American religion. And so that's one of my places of hopefulness.
Well, I've really enjoyed the first session and getting to talk with you all. And I'll just say for those participating, the second half, we're going to intentionally be more positive. The first three, we're digging in to trying to look to problematize, like setting this anniversary aside and making each little moment, right, of shaking in the last 20 years an exception. We're trying to recognize that they are revelatory of what we have to deal with. And one of the things, when I've just been thinking about doing this with you, is that both of you represent, to me, people who are invested in, or maybe have recognized that liberation involves a kind of unlearning, and that there's a prophetic act in the call for new framing stories. And so that's where we'll get to, right, in the second half. But the act of unlearning is really important. And I think the notion of decline, there's so many bits that are connected to it, but the idea that civil religion is the only thriving religion in the empire, and it is that's something that would be wonderful to unlearn, because I'm regularly told that's the case. So Any final thoughts? Like I'm just super excited to get to do this with you too.
I feel the same way.
I'm glad we're talking about this. I feel like I learned some things today.
Yeah, me
All
too.
right. Well, we will see you next week. Remember, apply to any of the emails with questions. And yeah,